This week, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cheryl Hyde. Dr. Hyde is an associate professor in the School of Social Work. Her areas of scholarship include anti-oppressive praxis, community and organizational transformation, social movements and societal change, and macro practice ethics. Dr. Hyde was inducted as a research fellow into the Society for Social Work Research, where she was the founding co-chair of the Community and Neighborhood Research Cluster and current co-chair of the Community Research Special Interest Group. She's been the principal investigator on multiple multi-year research projects, and her current research focuses on the impact of contingency labor on human service agency culture, service delivery, and workforce development. She's published over 60 articles and book chapters and is the recipient of numerous awards for her work. She's a past recipient of the Contributions to Feminist Scholarship Award presented by the Council of Social Work Education's Commission on the Role and Status of Women. In 2021, she received the College of Public Health's Excellence in Teaching Award. And currently, Dr. Hyde is faculty fellow for the Public Policy Lab, and has recently been elected as the new chair of the Association of Community Organizing and Social Action. So welcome, Dr. Hyde. Really looking forward to hearing your talk, and I'll just turn it over to you now.
Thank you. Let me see. We good? So thanks, Heather, for that very lovely introduction, and thank everyone for coming. This webinar format's a little weird. I have no idea who's out there and what you're doing, but hopefully this will be engaging enough. This is really two of my favorite topics, cultural humility, which is an important aspect of anti-oppressive praxis, as well as community engaged research. So I'm going to present some thoughts on both and how we can bring them together. And then I'm hoping we have plenty of time for questions and whatever version of webinar discussion we can do. So just very quickly, this is my goal for today. I'd like to talk a little bit about the community research continuum. When Heather first contacted me about doing a presentation, she asked me if I could do it on community participatory research. And I said, well, let's open it up a little more to community research in general. That said, I also think we could open this up to all research. I think a number of the points that I hope to make today are points that, if you're doing sort of secondary data analysis, you might want to sort of reframe your approach to that data given some of the topics and issues that I'm going to raise. After I talk about the research continuum, I'd like to define what cultural humility is and is not, and then share some thoughts about how I think cultural humility impacts community engaged research or informs community engaged research. So here we go. So this, and you've probably seen versions of this continuum, probably ad nauseum, on what community engaged research is. It's been my experience as I sort of review, journal manuscripts for publication or review conference abstracts, that a lot of scholars claim they're doing community-based research, but in fact, they're really not. So one thing I'd like us to really kind of pay attention to is the level to which the community, and it could be a geographic community, it could be a community of interest, it could be a community sort of defined by some aspect of cultural identity. Whatever the community is, that it really does have an authentic place at the table in terms of shaping, owning, and driving the research. And the farther we get towards it being community driven, the more we're really doing community engaged research. As opposed to at the other end, sort of investigator driven or even just community placed, which is, you as a researcher just sort of go in the community, get information, and then come out. That's very much an extraction model. And doesn't really honor, I think, the lived experiences of the community. It rather treats the community members as a commodity that we just take information from. I emphasize that point because that's the impression of most researchers if you ask community members. That's how they see us as researchers. So even if you aren't that kind of a researcher, you are carrying that representation into any sort of partnership that you might be doing. This is a model that I've adapted from Hartman and DeWolf, and the citation is down at the bottom of the screen, in which the reason why I like their particular model or aspects of their model is that it really sort of visually shows the overlap between community and researcher. And that overlap, that's sort of the sweet spot where we want to do our partnering. But it also suggests that each sphere, the researcher sphere and the community sphere, also bring sort of unique vantage points, unique perspectives to the partnership. So in this case, the community is bringing their own lived experience and the knowledge that they get out of that. They also bring what they call actionable knowledge, and that's knowledge based on trying to resolve issues, trying to collectively advocate for community interests. And then from the researcher sphere, it's a knowledge embedded in our own discipline, our own sort of focus areas, as well as methodological knowledge, the knowledge of how to do interviewing or how to do asset mapping or whatever particular method you might be employing. To a large extent, I think this is a good depiction of what we are aiming for. I would say, however, that we shouldn't assume that the community also doesn't have some discipline or methodological knowledge, nor should we necessarily assume that the researcher is not part of that community with lived experience. It will be different, perhaps, because of other factors, but there are times when these circles could really almost fully overlap, depending on the nature of your research. I've listed some ideal qualities of these partnerships. And when people talk about the partnerships, or you read about this in the literature, it's things like respect and reciprocity. There's a lot of emphasis on trust, highly collaborative. I also think that what real community engaged research does is it's really about a sort of a part of empowerment praxis, and meaning that one of the things that should be happening is either a transfer or a building of the capacity of the community to engage in this work ultimately on their own, so that they can get what they need. So a lot of really solid community engaged research is combined with an action element. In other words, it's done in service to what the community is attempting to rectify. And in that sense, as a researcher, one becomes almost like a sort of servant to that community to provide them with various knowledge, skills, whatever, so that they can pursue what they want to in terms of collective action. One of the courses I teach several courses that sort of revolve around community organizing, and in community organizing or any sort of collective mobilization effort, research is not something that's done as evaluation at the end. Research is one of the very early stages of this kind of collective activism, and it is done with the constituent group or the community group in a way that builds that community base for action, as well as gets the information we need that will inform our strategies. So research, this kind of research can become a very important element in a larger sort of collective change plan. So this breaks down the some of the stages of a partnership, which research, community engaged research is. And this is based on some work that I did with some colleagues at the University of Maryland. The left-hand column, the partnership stage, outlines 6 stages of development. And as much as we as researchers might just want to jump right in there and get our data, that is actually way down the list of stages. It's a lot of relationship building up front. And at each stage, at a minimum, we should be asking who is initiating or leading this stage, and what is the nature of our relationship? So is the issue or opportunity? Is that something that a community group maybe has come to you and said, we would like some help, some assistance? Or are you saying, oh, I bet that community would be really good for me to do something, to gather data? And then when you move, if you move past that initial stage, who is actually inviting the partnership becomes, that also will determine the nature of the relationship, and so on and so forth. What we found when we did an examination of, I think we looked at over 50 sort of collaborations and partnerships that had research at their center with community groups in Baltimore. What we found is that what's called the threshold dimension was critical, because this is the stage after you agree to partner that you really do the kind of the sometimes challenging work of developing the relationship. So this is where you really establish what that's going to look like, how you're going to operate. This is where you sort of learn about each other. This is where trust does or does not develop. This is where respect is or is not manifest. And so we found that groups that took that phase seriously, really spent time, they built a solid foundation. Groups that didn't, partnerships that didn't, for whatever reason, and often it was a rush to get to data collection, oddly enough, what would happen is it created a kind of ripple effect through the rest of the partnership project, so that conflict emerged, miscommunication became more and more apparent. There was some mistrust. So basically, if you don't attend to those relationships in a very serious way and lay the foundation for how you want to proceed, how you really want this to look early on, you're basically building a house on sand. And beyond just the damage that can do to your immediate partnership, because it's often difficult then to circle back and rectify the situation, it sets up for mistrust down the line for other researchers who might want to work with that community, or that community in terms of trusting academics to actually do the right thing. So the question is, how do we do this? And this is where I believe cultural humility plays a key role, because in this threshold, especially in this threshold dimension, this is where we should be doing a very deep dive into our own stuff, if you will. So let me show you what I mean by stuff. So first, here's what cultural humility is. It's become, I think, a term that's getting bandied about a lot lately. I know in social work, that's it's becoming in more and more. It actually has been around for quite a while, and it originated out of the work of Tervalon Murray Garcia, who really wanted to figure out ways of educating medical providers, in this case, physicians, to be more aware and respectful of their clients, patients. And in doing so, it meant that the physicians themselves really had to do some critical self-evaluation to really understand how they were vis-a-vis their patient populations. So I've highlighted, I think, some of the really key aspects of cultural humility. It is a lifelong commitment because we're always sort of learning and, learning and growing and, trying to figure things out, and new ways of seeing things come down the line all the time. And so we learn to sort of take that in and maybe adjust. It's about self-evaluation and self-critique. It is not about beating oneself up. It is about sort of, because that doesn't do anybody any good. It's about redressing power imbalances. And I feel like this is a key aspect of cultural humility, is that it gets at the issues of power and privilege. And finally, it is sort of mutually beneficial, non-paternalistic partnerships. And so it's very much an in-relationship approach. Yeager and Bauer Wu have laid out a sort of inventory of what they think we as practitioners, or in this case, or we as researchers, should be looking at. So let me just quickly touch on those. One is what's called a reflection of self. This is where we really look at our own cultural identity. We look at our membership in race, in terms of racial groups, ethnic groups, citizenship, education, gender identity, sexual orientation identity, class status, any disability, etc. And this is a very important first step. I know a lot of us have sort of started this step. And what I will say is that what you have to do is shift from just understanding, I am middle class, I am white, I am a cisgender female, to connecting that to whether or not those individual identities, dimensions, how are they related to larger groups in terms of societal power and privilege? So I, as a white person, gain racial privilege and power, not because I'm running around with the Klan, but because historically and currently, whites, as opposed to people of color, have been afforded certain benefits. Did I ask for these benefits? No, I don't recall ever asking for them, but they've still come my way. And often what people who are in these groups that have societal power and privilege, one of the challenges is to understand that what we think is normal actually is a privilege. So it doesn't dawn on me when I walk into a store and write out a check that I will be asked for multiple pieces of identification, right? I do know from both observing and from what friends and colleagues have told me, that if you are a Black woman going in there and you write out a check, the chances of you being asked for multiple pieces of identification are very, very high, right? And when that kind of stuff happens over and over and over again, where we just, because of our gender or our race or our class or whatever other attribute, can just sort of move through, whereas other groups are constantly, sort of harassed or stopped or questioned, that's a very powerful way in which oppression gets reproduced. We don't want our research to further contribute to the reproduction of oppression. We want our research, if we're truly community engaged, to be one that reflects that we understand and are going to use some of this, our position to open up the space. So it's very much about sort of learning how to open up space for other groups that have been marginalized to come in and fundamentally alter the structure and process. So that's what reflection of self is. And it's an extraordinarily, I think if folks are really serious about this, it's a lot of work. I've seen superficial versions of this done that really don't get you very far, although they might feel good. It's a lot of work, and it means a lot of backtracking and really rethinking how one is moving through, this world. The second, a reflection of setting, is what is it that we're representing? What's our home base? So for us as researchers, it might be, the academy or the university. And again, we need to be very cognizant of what that represents. You go to some areas in North Philadelphia and you ask them, what do they think of Temple University? And you will not get an overwhelmingly positive response. You could be a perfectly nice person. You could be incredibly well-intentioned. You could have, a magic box that's going to unlock all sorts of things for this community. But until you sort of name and address and hear their concerns about how they have been treated or their perception of your institutional home base, you're not going to be able to make the sort of progress you think you can. Bear in mind also that for a lot of folks, a university is a university. They may have had a bad experience at the hands of someone from Penn or Drexel. They don't care that that's not Temple. It's a university. So I think it's very important to understand how the communities with which you hope to engage understand academy and or the university. Because while we may get great benefits from it, it's not seen that way by a lot of communities. The other thing I'll say about this is, and this is going to sound a little ironic, but weird, from where some of us sit, and we look around, we think, God, Penn is really loaded in terms of endowment, or there's Harvard and stuff, and Temple, not so much, right? We do well, though. To an outsider, Temple looks like a very, very rich institution because relative to, their day-to-day lives, it is. So I think we also have to be mindful of our opinions of or our thoughts about the institution aren't going to necessarily be shared by by outsiders. And it seems ridiculous to outsiders if we maybe complain about a lack of resources. The third is reflection of profession. What does the profession that you're in represent to the community that you are working, that you hope to work with? In social work, I think we like to think that we're all, well-intentioned, we're here to help people, and et cetera, et cetera. But for a lot of communities, social work is seen as part of a larger group of people that control their families, that are part of surveillance, that don't open up possibilities, but take away things, that monitor and control. So again, that's something that you want to really figure out how to own and explore. I can't speak for the other professions, in the college about how they are viewed. But I do think that, that's something that everybody, should sort of think about. It might make it for a fun, faculty meeting conversation. And finally, what is your role, or reflect on you as a researcher? And here it's very important to be mindful of the history of quote unquote science and research in marginalized communities. And we all know, about the sort of, the Tuskegee, syphilis study, and we all know of, the other kinds of unethical studies. But do we also know that, what Temple Hospital did to women on welfare in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s around forced sterilization? So I think it's really, really critical to, again, allow the community to express their concerns and to really listen to those and to figure out how you are going to not be that, not replicate that. In a lot of ways, the reflection on setting and profession and researcher, that's the context that you are carrying into any community engaged work. And what that means is that you need to really be mindful. It's not, in many ways, it's not about you as a person, it's about what you represent. And that part of our work is to recenter all of this on the lives of those who have lived the experience, as opposed to centering the whole thing on us. Whoops, what did I do? Okay. A lot of people sort of say, well, isn't this just another version of cultural competency? And it isn't. So the short answer is no. But let me sort of explain why, because I think there's a lot of folks in the quote unquote helping profession that are very enamored with this sort of cultural competency model. I have to say personally, and as a practitioner as well, I don't like it at all. And I've actually never liked it. The reason is because cultural competency is essentially a linear model where you learn about groups and only other groups. So it never asks you to really reflect back on yourself. And it really creates the kind of exotic other. So culture is something that other groups have. And when I work with students around understanding their cultural identity, I will almost always have a white student say, but I don't have a culture. Because we've so normed everything on whiteness in this, at least in this country, that they don't see it as something, they don't see it as an actual cultural identity or part of their cultural identity. And we also tend to talk about culture from this cultural competency model, which is, sort of only Haitians have culture, or only Cape Verdeans have culture, or only people from Vietnam have culture. And so I find the cultural competence approach to be very dangerous in that it sort of, I used to refer to it as sort of populations on parade. Where this week we would learn about this group, next week we learn about that group, and that, sort of if I I'm going to see a Haitian client this week, well, I'll just read the chapter on Haitian families and I'll know everything about that person. It also implies that we will reach competency in somebody else's culture. And I don't for a minute think that I can be fully, quote unquote, competent in understanding a culture that's different from mine. So there's that really concerns me. The other piece that concerns me about cultural competency is that it never uncenters from what they refer to as majority, in our case, sort of white, male, middle-class culture. So that's seen as normal and everything else is different and sort of revolves around that, which I find very problematic. What cultural humility gives us is, first of all, this notion of intersectionality, which is not just an additive effect. It actually, I think, is more than that. It means that, my experience as a white woman might share some commonalities with, say, a Black or Latina woman, but there's also going to be important differences. And it's how our various cultural components come together to create us as sort of unique individuals within a context of larger cultural dynamics. So culture in this case is very much a sort of constellation of everything, and it's always sort of shifting. There's a fluidity to this that you don't find in the cultural competency model. And here's the great thing. Everybody now has them. Everybody has culture. We all, what we sort of see as, yeah, my family always does that. That might actually be a cultural practice that was never named as such. Cultural humility also brings in attention to power and privilege, and why those differentials exist and how we could challenge or diminish them. It is very much built on inclusion rather than othering. And the focus really is on us. It's the work I need to do as a teacher, as a researcher, as a practitioner. It's a work I need to do in order to be a better partner with others. And part of that is really learning to listen to the lived experiences of others. So I have work I do on myself, and I am also working to make sure that it's the community that the project is centered on. In this case, it's lifelong. When I sort of think of where I started with some of this stuff 10, 20, 30 years ago, and how I think about it now, it's very different, and it will probably be different in 10 or 20 years. I think it's one of the gifts of teaching, as well as really engaged research, is, you learn different perspectives and you incorporate them in the work you do. And is there an endpoint? No, there's not. There's a lot of flexibility and reflection and sort of humbleness, but you never hit that point of full expertise, which I can imagine can drive some people nuts. So here are some habits to cultivate. I want to be mindful of the time too. Let me just touch on a couple. Some are pretty obvious, like you need to make time and be flexible. One of the most important habits to cultivate is curbing one's ego. And again, because being non-defensive, being really sort of authentically present to do engaged listening, even if it's messages and information that is uncomfortable for you, is really, really important. And so sort of setting your own ego aside is part of that process. I've put curiosity up here, and there's sort of a joke, in the dating world, where one person, two people on a date, and one person goes, "Oh, okay, well, enough about me. What do you think about me?" That is not the curiosity we want, right? So I think a lot of researchers are curious, but they're curious about getting answers to their questions rather than being curious about what questions does a community want answered. They may or may not be different. So it's also a curiosity shift. Mistake learning. You're going to make mistakes. This is, you're going to be vulnerable. You're going to open yourself up. This is, I think, often hard for academics or researchers to do because, we really pride ourselves, and rightly so to a certain extent, in the knowledge and skills that we've developed. But if they're getting in the way of really forming the partnership you want, you're going to have to sort of rethink some stuff. You may say something that just doesn't fly well with some community members. And if you've created a relationship where they will call you out, that's actually an amazingly good sign that you're on the right track. And if when they call you out, you thank them because it's a gift, that's even a better sign. So think of mistakes and having those pointed out as a gift from your partner because they feel strongly enough about you and the relationship that they're willing to take that risk. And it's huge, and it's going to feel uncomfortable and icky and all sorts of things in that moment. But if you sit with that and just take it in and show that you're really trying to learn from that, that is a huge moment in the building of those relationships. Stepping back is also part of this process. We don't have to know everything right off. And so if something comes up in these relationship buildings, and you're just not sure how to go, just, literally step back, just take some time to really sort of think about it and kind of process it, and then move back into the relationship. And finally, know that you don't know. We don't know everything. What we know from certain sources isn't necessarily going to transfer to where you are now. So, and I think that's part of what keeps us kind of humble. So as a way of kind of wrapping up, I wanted to sort of return to the partnership stages that I provided earlier and offer up some questions that we might want to ask ourselves at these stages. This is by no means an exhaustive list of questions, but I'm hoping that it kind of gives you a sense of some of the ways in which you could proceed with this. So for issue and opportunity, in addition to whose issue is this, I would also ask whose interests are being served, who is going to probably benefit from pursuing this issue and opportunity, and how are they going to benefit? And it doesn't have to be an either or, but really sort of understand from the get-go, what are the likely sort of the end game, the end goal on this. Second of all, as you begin the process of building a partnership, you should immediately, and then I would say continuously ask, what are the power dynamics at work with all the key actors? Are certain groups or subgroups in the community being left out, and what does that mean? Does the community gain from this? Are they authentically at the table at this time, or are you shaping this invitation? The threshold dimensions, where you really do the deep dive into building your relational foundation. How are you going about doing it? What does inclusivity look like? What accountability practices have you instituted? And is the community okay with those? One of the things I think that's important in this is the community is not a monolithic structure. They're going to have their own stuff. Where you may be engaged with one part of the community, and lo and behold, there's another section of the community that is really, really not happy that this one group is getting all this attention. Some communities are sort of kind of cohere and knit together well. Other communities have a lot of internal conflict and strife for a whole host of internal and external reasons. So it's not just, are you as the researcher being inclusive of the community, but is the whole thing that you're creating inclusive? And that might mean some hard conversations to have with your community partner about who in the community is or is not included and why. The partnership agreement. There is a bit of a back and forth in literature on how formal these should be. And I think probably a lot of this is driven by whatever institutional requirements we're in. But at this point, you do want to think about everything from how are you going to protect and facilitate the community, to reflecting, incorporating, and compensating for the expertise of members of that community. And the compensation thing, I think, is a particularly tricky one. I have a neighbor who directs a fairly prominent community organization up in North Philly, and she will not partner. She does not like partnering with researchers unless they put some community members on staff on the research team, and they're paid as sort of researchers. The sort of $25 Target gift certificate, she says, doesn't quite cut it for some of the asks. So I think, we may need to really rethink how it is that we are compensating for expertise. And then operating, how is the thing being staffed? Who gets recognized? Is training offered so that community members can actually facilitate, participate? Are we training, in how to do interviews or how to, do surveys and stuff? And that moves us more into sort of the action research realm. And then finally, under mutual benefit, this in a lot of ways for research partnerships is about findings. How are they going to be used? Who owns them? How are they going to be decimated? That's a Freudian slip right there. How are they going to be disseminated? And what will the community get back for that? For us, both getting grants and publishing are sort of our coins of the realm. Community members, if they really are happy to be working with you, they may think it's great that, an article has come out of this, but at the end of the day, that's not going to put food on their table. So really think carefully about, sort of what that means. And, should community members be authors on any articles? Should they co-present at conferences? And if so, who's going to pay for that? So these are the kind of things that I think really need to be worked out if we want the community fully at the table. So with that, Heather, let's open it up.
Sure. Thank you so much,
Sure.
Cheryl. It was really a wonderful talk. I do have a few questions in the Q&A. So Matt has asked, can you please discuss how you collectively determine whether CBPR activities count as human subjects research versus quality improvement, where no IRB would be required?
Oh.
That's how I felt.
Matt. So, here's what I've heard. First of all, I am not the person to ask about IRB because I really, on all honesty, wish I'd gone into history where you don't have to actually deal with it because everybody's dead. But what I will say is one of the things I have heard, and maybe other folks know it and can sort of put it in the Q&A, is there have been some changes to IRB so that qualitative research does not have to undergo IRB scrutiny. Because there's something about the nature of the data. Interesting. Yeah. Beyond that, I honestly, I'm gonna plead this. That's something I just don't know. I would suggest, and I don't know if at some point, I think, us having a kind of seminar that deals very specifically with community engagement and IRB issues, I think would be a really, really good thing for a lot of us to have. In part because I think one of the things that the IRB doesn't quite understand is you can't, if you're doing authentic community partner research, you can't go ahead pre-research with all your protocols and stuff. Those get built in with the community. And at least my experience with the Temple IRB is you have to have all your ducks in a row before you go out into, go out and do the research. So it's a much more linear process. Community engaged research is a much more back and forth iterative process. And so I actually would really welcome a sort of, discussion presentation with IRB that sort of gets some of these issues. Because I think, Matt, I think it's a good question. I do not know the answer to it, though.
Well, thank you. I think you're practicing what you've just preached by just
yes, right.
Matt has another question.
Okay.
Can you speak to situations where the mistrust is not so much between community members and researchers, but rather among various factions of people who all represent the community?
Yeah.
Is it possible to do community engaged research when the community members don't trust one another?
So we actually dealt with this a lot in Baltimore, and I've dealt with it a little bit in Philadelphia, but Baltimore is one of these cities that is like super neighborhood oriented. And it's also a city where if you disagree with your neighbor, like 5 driveways down, they just go and form another neighborhood association. I mean, so they have like thousands of neighborhood associations. I think one is to sort of really try and understand the dynamics of what's going on in a community before you really sort of start it, engaging with a group. So if you know that, a community has been particularly hard hit, say by industry leaving or something, chances are there's going to be there might be some economic infighting. There could be issues of violence within a community that have generated conflict. So if you kind of get a general sense of what's going on with the community, it's important. I also think you'd have a decision to make about whether or not you need, what your parameters of a community is. So how are you establishing the boundaries of your community? Is it, because a lot is just, a lot of, it's like I live in West Mount Airy, right? In Philadelphia, and that has certain meaning to some folks. Some of that's accurate, some of it isn't. But it's like the boundaries are really, who knows how they got created. So part of it is to ask yourself, what is it and who is it I'm interested in partnering with? They may be a member, that group may be part of a larger community, but do you even need the entire community?
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about the community of North Philadelphia, what does that even mean? Because it's a huge geographic spread. Or South Philly, what does that mean? So I think to sort of be really clear about what your intent is with the community and why you're choosing the sort of delineation of community that you are. If that means that that your catchment area is such that it does include groups that are in conflict with each other, you're going to have to take some time to work out some sort of agreement with how to work with both, or be very clear and give one group the option of opting out. But you are going to have to engage with, and I have to say, this is a mistake I think that a lot of foundations make, is they want to work with community leaders and they'll kind of go with the kind of loudest community leader. And that isn't necessarily the group that they should be working with. So I think if your catchment area for your research includes groups where there's friction, et cetera, it may be that you're going to have some focus groups or a community summit, or you're going to have to facilitate something so that either issues get aired or you really understand what you're walking into. It is going to be an extra important step in your process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Bethlehem asks, well, first she says, great talk, I appreciate you. And then do you have suggestions for facilitation or facilitator guides or tools to help cultivate cultural humility among health practitioners, researchers, and faculty?
Well, oh God, Heather, I can't remember. It's that CCPA. What's the name of that?
Community, yes, CCPH, Partnership, Community Campus Partnership for Health.
Right. So of which we are a member. Mm-hmm. They often have very good resources to and it is specifically geared to people in various health fields. So that would be one place I would start, is the CCPH website. Another place to start is not so much with health research per se, but to look at some of the work that comes out of, I would say, sort of sociology and anthropology on action research, because they deal with these dynamics at a different end. So it isn't the health that gets front loaded, but it's the process that they really attend to, I think, pretty carefully. I think, there's some, sociologists that do sort of grounded theory and action research where, and if they've got a good methods section, they really talk about the work that they had to do in order to really engage with that research, or how they embedded themselves. I also think, I think there's also some interesting work if we free up our notion of what research is a little bit. Combine, well, I mean, I think like Sarah Bass, in the college, I think her work around different ways of communicating could be transferred to, also those are engagement strategies. I mean, communication is part of engagement. So I've sort of looked there. I would look at like Omar Martinez in social work has done a lot of back and forth with around Latino populations and, around the issue of HIV/AIDS. And I saw he just posted the other day how excited he was to be working with a Latino company business around some marketing stuff. So it's like rethinking the community as not just a source of information for us, but as a genuine partner that you want to flourish. And so, supporting a business in that community, that's a significant thing. Thinking of different ways just to communicate and get your points, understood, and you understanding their points is a huge thing. So I think actually we have examples of that in the college of some of our colleagues who have really kind of pushed the box a little bit. I would take my cues from them.
Thank you. I agree. I will say I've used your cultural identity inventory in multiple classes, and that has sparked a lot of really deep introspection, and has only had very positive feedback from students about it. So that may be a tool that people could use too.
Right. And I'll put in a plug because the 4th edition has just come out. It's and for folks in the public health field, they'll know it's Margaret Minkler is the editor, and it's Community Organizing and Community Building for Health and Social Equity. And Mary is, I think the world of her, and she's been incredibly supportive and really encouraged me to write that piece. And I use it also in my organizing class to get students. And I think what's interesting is, a lot of students will sort of say, well, I've done this once, like, it's, so I've done this, and so I've sort of checked it off and moved on. And I think one of the things that's really important is that for our students and anybody we're sort of working with, is that we model the willingness and the ability to keep digging, so I will also do this inventory, because, and I share with my students, 5 years ago, here was my thinking on X, and now it's really changed because of, I think of all the conversations we've had around transgender identity, transgender rights, and transgender health is completely different for me than when I first came into the feminist movement a really, really, really long time ago, where it was just women good, man bad, end of story, right? And now, it's very binary, and it's, and I'm very thankful to the students that really pushed me on this. That's an area that I found I had to do a lot of work on. I'm still doing a lot of work on it, but I think the more we model our willingness to keep pulling back the layers, to really sort of seeing things from different vantage points, and vantage points we may not agree. You don't have to agree with it, but it gets you to step outside your box. I think that's incredibly important. I think it makes us just better humans, but it certainly made me a better teacher and researcher.
I couldn't agree more. And I do it myself during. So Courtney asks, well, again, first she says, this was wonderful, thank you. Can you talk more about how a researcher going into a community who are experiencing a high level of burnout can navigate the community with a culturally sensitive approach without adding to the fatigue the community may already be experiencing?
Right. That's a really good question. And I would say also, there's also, first of all, in this particular moment in time, everybody is fatigued pretty much. I mean, we've just really, I think we've all just kind of hit the limits of this, whatever this is, we're all caught in. So I think it's important for us to realize our level of fatigue. And for a lot of us, we have, we have an ability to either step back. I'll just speak for myself. I've got really good health insurance. I've got a roof over my head. I've got all sorts of things that sort of mitigate the impact of that fatigue. And I feel like, Jesus, this is awful. So, for communities that are already stretched, the fatigue that they're going to be feeling is, I think, pretty intense. So part of it is, I think, to have a conversation about, with them about, sort of recognizing that, sort of naming it and recognizing that fatigue, and talking to them about what has the root causes of it. How do they understand it? What is sort of driving it? And is there a way that collectively all of us could come together to sort of push back against that? Are there things, are there ways of us leveraging our resources maybe to help mitigate that? Now, I think I know who this Courtney is, and she's a doctoral student, if that's the case. And so she's not going to have the level of resources that I might have. But I think that's where our networking comes in. That, in terms of what other, are there resources that we can bring into these communities, to sort of assist on the community's terms, not because we see it. I might look at a community and say, oh, they need X, Y, and Z. And they would say, no, we need A, B, and C. I think it's important that the community define what they need. And then I think, part of what we can do is put a call out, a community says they really need help doing, block to block cleanup. Well, is that something we could organize, and that then helps, I think, contribute to, that might help sort of having their sort of lived where they are better. I also think that sometimes if a community is just really fried, it's not the time to be doing the research.
Right.
If the research is just going to be an added burden, and we don't have any way of countering it with maybe other resources or things like that, then I would say, unfortunately, probably have to walk away.
Thank you.
Which I hope you don't, Courtney, because I do like your work. If it's the Courtney I think it is.
She said it was.
Okay, yeah.
Jillian asks if you have any resources you'd recommend reading before trying to start such a research project. I think you just shared one. There's also the Community Campus Partnerships for Health website, right, I know of. Any others?
When I was preparing for this talk, I was really sort of impressed with stuff that's coming out of the nursing field. If you just put in, in a search engine, cultural humility in health, a lot of very interesting resources come up in nursing, which so I think, and it's more from a practitioner's point of view. But I strongly feel that if we understand our research as in part practice as well, I feel like there's some carryover. So I would say that. I would say another place that I've really sort of learned the sort of process of kind of recentering onto the community is the literature on photo voice, which really gives over data collection and analysis to to your quote unquote respondents. It's like they go out, they document their world, they come back, they try and figure out what their world is, and you facilitate that process. And that is, I think, some of those accounts can be very, very powerful. So those are the places I would start. But if I think of some stuff, I can pass it on to Heather, and maybe we can have it posted on the SERP website.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. We are over time now. There was one more question about confidentiality, but maybe Judith, you'll want to email Dr. Hyde privately and talk about that offline. I don't want to I want to respect everybody's time here today.
Right.
But
I
thank
mean,
you again so
yeah,
much.
yeah. Oh, sure. This was a lot of fun. Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sure have you back again to talk on some other related topic. Your experience is really invaluable to us all. So thank
Well,
you again.
my pleasure. As my daughter says, I'm a nerd and I will talk about anything. So there we go.
Perfect. We
Yeah,
like
right. Okay. And thank everyone out there in the virtual ether for listening.
Yes, thank you very much and happy Friday to you all.
Happy Friday.
Take care.